determine what's good or what is bad policy? And I think that depends upon what we define as the goal of a particular policy. You can't really call something good or bad until you define what it is you wish to accomplish. So I think we have to define our goals and analyze policies in light of that. Different panels today have revealed different priors. District Attorney Becton on the DA panel said that all the DAs, for example, were interested in community safety, but addressed community safety through different lenses. And it will be the same, I believe, with our panel. The panel is policing public safety. To address what's good or bad public policy, we have to say what we think is encompassed within the notions of public safety. So I posed 2 prompts to the panel, and we don't have to follow them, but maybe they'll set up some structure for a good conversation. The first prompt that I had posed to the panel is, what does public safety mean to you? And the second is, what can we imagine would be the role and function of police, if any, which I think would be addressed within the concept each person has of what amounts to public safety. I hope we can find some common ground, but I at least hope we can accomplish something the last panel did, which was have some time for a question or two from the audience. Okay. We have a great panel with people with different experiences and perspectives, and I'm so happy to have all of our panelists here today. And I'll give a short bio in the order that people will speak. I've asked the panelists to speak for about 12 minutes or no more than 15, and then we'll have an exchange, and I hope we'll have time for audience questions. The first panelist is Professor Jamelia Morgan. She has had a journey after law school that's included stops at the ACLU National Prison Project, the Abolitionist Law Center, several law schools before landing at her current home, which is Northwestern University, where she's a law professor and directs the Center for Race and Disability Justice. I'll be particularly interested in perspectives on the intersections with race, disability, and policing. Next up will be John Milhiser. He is the elected state's attorney in Sangamon County, Illinois, which encompasses the capital, Springfield, Illinois. He's been a prosecutor for over 25 years and was the U.S. Attorney also for the Central District of Illinois during parts of the previous administration. And it'll be really interesting to hear his perspectives on policing, given that in Sangamon County there are over 30 law enforcement agencies, and when he was U.S. Attorney he had to deal with the alphabet soup of agencies and bureaucracies within the federal government. So he'll be particularly well informed about structures and approaches to policing. Next up will be Shakir Rahman. He is a lawyer and community organizer with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. He has experiences with policing in LA's Skid Row. He'll talk about that, as well as a legacy of eugenics and police reform. And before he moved to the City of Angels, he was doing impact litigation for Bronx defenders, so he has a wide range of experience. The last of our speakers is Rafael Mangual, who is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, editor, author, scholar, commentator, member of the Council on Criminal Justice. His recent book is Criminal Injustice, which was published in 2022. He's a terrific speaker and thinker, and I really welcome his comments and remarks. So let's go in that order, with people taking roughly the time allotted, but and you have the prompts. So, Professor Morgan.
Get a little relief. All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a delight to be here. I've learned quite a bit today, and I just want to thank you all for sticking around and hearing what I think will be a really important panel on this question of policing and public safety. So I'm a professor of law at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law, and I teach criminal law, disability law, and critical race theory. Not that critical race theory, but the actual critical race theory, which I'm also happy to talk about. Before that, I was a civil rights litigator, where I was primarily responsible for sort of suing prisons and police for constitutional violations. Before that, actually, I grew up in Southern California in the early 90s, particularly in the LA County area, and had a number of experiences with the local law enforcement down there. And I think it's important just to center my perspective. I'm one of 5. I had 2 older brothers. One was murdered late in life, I guess in his early 40s, and and then the other one spent 10 years in California Pelican State Prison. So when I tell you that there's a complexity to the way that I look at these issues, there is, but there's a perspective, and I think that's important to sort of lift that before I start to share this information. So the question and the helpful prompt that we can talk about is sort of this question of what is public safety. And so because Chuck helpfully gave us these questions, I was thinking about it throughout the day, just listening to each speaker and their account of public safety that was maybe implicit in some of the remarks and their approach. And so what I wanted to do was, again, bring in community perspectives that might not have centered in the discussions today. And I want to focus in particular on abolitionist community groups and groups that are advocating for radical change. Why that's sort of the movements that, again, I grew up in as a young lawyer and the movements that I have supported as a litigator, right? So again, just to center my perspective and to maybe give us something to think about as we, now I think have a recognition that there's a multitude of interests within what we term the community or the people. I thought it might be interesting to think about what these groups are centering on the table for discussions about public safety. So what does it mean to me? Again, if sharing my perspectives and the fact that I am informed by abolitionist communities, I want to sort of talk about how they're approaching this question. So there are a number of communities that are actually seeking transformative change to the institution of policing. The definitions of public safety, I would say, don't always factor into the way that mainstream media accounts, let's say, talk about public safety, but I wonder if we can maybe grapple with some of what these communities are seeking. And again, to note the plural on communities, right, there's this recognition it's not a unilateral or rather monolithic, uniform conception of community. There are a variety of different interests. And many of these definitions of public safety have been lifted today. So Professor Jody Armour referenced some of these ideas earlier. I think one of the things, if you look to the writings, the platforms, and that's sort of my corpus of information, right? What are abolitionist groups saying about public safety in their platforms, right? If these are communities that are actively organizing, what can we read? So oftentimes that means I'm looking on X and I'm looking on websites, right? So it's a different body of information than I think many of us researchers are used to, but I see this as an important kind of corpus of information. So they're seeking broader definitions of public safety that do include protections beyond maybe the traditional crimes that we have classified as serious crimes, right? So front and center, they're thinking about, of course, the problem of police violence, and we know that there are challenges to bringing prosecutions against police. And then also, I think we recognize that there are forms of police violence that are indeed lawful, right? That would be constitutional under the Fourth Amendment, but that do result in intrusions, right? If we can think about the kind of intrusion of a stop and frisk. Even if there is reasonable suspicion for it, it is still an intrusion to the body. And abolitionist communities aren't so much concerned with the distinction between what is sort of lawful and unlawful. They're again focused on a conception of public safety that's really grappling with the material consequences to people. All right, so they're also centering issues like environmental degradation, evictions. I mean, here in Oakland, Moms for Housing, we saw that had the amazing protest, if you will, in terms of their ability to unite individuals to defend against evictions. They're also including, again, within their definition of public safety, conceptions of freedom from poverty and homelessness, so an affirmative, affordable, or a right, rather, to affordable and accessible housing. So essentially, as a lawyer, I look at this, and a legal scholar, quite frankly, I look at these as sort of conceptions of socioeconomic rights built into this understanding of safety, again, if you look at their platforms and what they're advocating for. All right, so one of the things that I think we can think about too is this kind of question of what to do about violence, right? So again, if there's a more expansive definition of public safety, how are these communities grappling with violence? So there's often the claim that, these radical community groups, I use the term radical in the Ella Baker sense, right? We're kind of tackling the root causes of which we're all in this room familiar with. They've been debated vigorously. I don't mean that as a term of derision. All right, so they're looking for sort of radical transformative change, and they do indeed care about violence, and in particular the violence that impact low-income communities of color. These communities intensely care about public safety. They often talk about personal experiences with violence, as I have in sharing my own story. Of course, these are their siblings, their families, their neighbors. But what it seems to me is that they're simply asking for a set of policy options or alternatives that do not simply require the law enforcement apparatus broadly. So we have traditional policing functions, or what abolitionists called soft police, right, just to use the term, centered in movements, which are child protective services. It can be behavioral health social workers if they serve a kind of punitive or policing function in terms of their tactics, right? So for those of us trying to understand where the leftist movements are going in terms of their discussions of public safety, think about traditional police, but not just traditional police, right? Beyond that conception. All right, so let me maybe capture the zeitgeist of what I'm trying to share in terms of a multitude of movements. All right, so because abolition and the kind of origins have a long history, right, to the first abolitionist movement to abolish chattel slavery, disability justice activists within abolitionist movement would say there was a second successful abolitionist movement, the movement for deinstitutionalization. Unsuccessful in the sense of the sort of lack of community-based infrastructure being built out after the institutionalization of large congregate state facilities. So we can kind of see that as a part of this genealogy of abolition. But if we think of our movements now, the abolitionists as maybe the third wave, a few of their thinkers are actively writing books, and one of their key thinkers, there were some quotes to Angela Davis. I guess I would put Angela Davis in maybe the sort of second wave of abolition, and now we're sort of thinking in the third wave, so to update some of the sourcing. All right, so Miriam Kaba, let's say. How does Miriam Kaba think about public safety? Miriam Kaba is an organizer, activist, and leading thinker in abolition, and to say that she's influential in the movement would be an understatement. This is a leading thought leader. All right, so a safe world, Kaba writes, is not one in which the police keep Black and other marginalized people in check through the threat of arrest, incarceration, violence, and death. When people consider a world without the police, they envision a society as violent as our current one, merely without law enforcement, and they shudder. As a society, we have been so indoctrinated with the idea that we solve problems by policing and caging people that many cannot imagine anything other than prisons and the police as a solution to violence and harm. People like me, again, I'm quoting Miriam, who want to abolish police and prisons, however, have a vision of a different society built on cooperation, instead of individualism, on mutual aid instead of self-preservation. What would the country look like if it had billions of extra dollars to spend on housing, food, and education for all? This change in society wouldn't happen immediately, but the protests show that many people are ready to embrace a different vision of safety and justice. Now, Miriam Kaba wrote this on June 12th, 2020, right? So the time in which she was writing, we're getting ready to start the greatest uprisings in terms of kind of cross-racial protests in US history after the George Floyd murder. All right, so that's one conception from the leading thinker of abolition. I'm arguing one of the. All right, so community groups advocating for radical change, again, reading their platforms, engaging with their ideas, are interested in more complex solutions to social problems like violence and predation, again, beyond the policing apparatus. Traditional and soft forms. Indeed, I think the usual criticisms of these communities as naive, might not fully engage with their platform because, again, it's a burgeoning movement. They're developing their ideas literally as we speak, not only in the theoretical context, but through actual on-the-ground organizing, right? So they're actually engaged in some of these efforts. All right, so they are concerned primarily with the root causes, what we would probably term the social determinants of crime, because they see the root causes as connected to violence prevention and responsive to the actual factors that contribute to crime. Here again, I think we see lots of new theorizing around human nature, this idea that if we can reconfigure social relations, we can make it so that individuals might have reduced opportunities to engage in harmful conflict. There are accounts, I think, of human nature within abolition that need to be grappled with maybe from the question of like moral theory, and maybe we might not share the optimism that abolitionist groups might have around human nature, but there's this idea that if we give individuals access to adequate and affordable housing, we need not rely on law enforcement apparatus to remove them from public spaces. If we would provide individuals with access to chronic and crisis behavioral health services, we wouldn't need to rely, again, on the arrest power to remove individuals with psychiatric disabilities from public places. 10 minutes. Does that mean that 2 minutes are left?
2 to 5.
Oh, wow, okay, sorry, all right. Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up. All right, so I think the way that I'm trying to articulate the kind of platform is a different kind of engagement with public safety. So extending the frame as to what counts as harm would mean there is an expansive conception of public safety and a variety of different metrics that we can see for measuring public safety and the ability of local communities to respond to harm. So you often see within abolitionist discourse, not only the request for more tools and sort of moving away from sort of what they've termed kind of punitive and carceral responsive to social harms, but a rejection of the idea that police are equipped to serve all of the social functions that they currently serve in society. And I would suspect that that's a point of agreement for even folks in this room, that police serve too many social functions in terms of their responding to individuals experiencing psychiatric crisis, responding to individuals who need social services and who are unsheltered. And indeed, if you look at the International Associations of Chiefs of Police, they agree with that too, right? So it's this interesting convergence around this idea that the police role needs to be reconceptualized and reduced, and eventually, I would say, according to the abolitionist sort of theorizing, rendered obsolete in terms of our reliance on police to respond to these social problems. I had a bunch of other statistics which I don't necessarily need to go into because I think that we have lifted them throughout the day in our various discussions of the racial disparities, but I want to at least maybe close with a discussion on accountability. So if it's a broader conception of public safety, this movement for transformative change does seek to divest from policing and invest in other forms of social provision. So there's kind of, I think, a conception that abolitionists just want to open up the prison gates and respond, accordingly to individuals who've committed serious violent crimes, if you will, through ineffective means. I don't think that's true. I think that they have developed through their platforms and kind of proposals a way to redirect resources to supportive and therapeutic services. Again, with the idea that if we give individuals what they need, they won't engage in acts of harm. But the accountability point, I think, is very important. I think one thing that we can take away is that when it comes to the problems of the state, police violence in particular, abolitionists also don't believe that those systems of policing and punishment is the way to achieve accountability. By which I say, after the kind of very public killing of Breonna Taylor, again, Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie, two other abolitionists, Andrea Ritchie, in addition to Miriam Kaba, is a leading abolitionist thinker. They made a point to write in Essence magazine, which is a prominent magazine geared towards Black women, that they did not advocate for prosecuting the officers that killed Breonna Taylor, which is an interesting point. Again, the community, if we see it as a unitary, was advocating for the prosecution. Kaba and Ritchie and abolitionist groups that I was following around that time did not advocate for that prosecution. They stated as follows, again, in the excerpt from Essence magazine: turning away from systems of policing and punishment doesn't mean turning away from accountability. It just means we stop setting the value of a life by how much time another person does in a cage for violating or taking it, particularly when the criminal punishment system has consistently made clear whose lives it will value and whose lives it will cage. Rather than seeking justice through the criminal legal system, they're seeking justice through, in their terms, a broader and deeper conception of justice and other for Breonna Taylor, and other survivors of family members harmed by police violence. They close the piece by offering their conception of reparative justice, a few of the components: repair and acknowledgement, dismissment and the termination of officers, so they do believe that they should lose their jobs. Restoration, which would include for the community affected by this incident, as well as the family, healing and mental health services, cessation, an end to the actions that caused the death of Breonna Taylor, and in particular, they did advocate for legislative reform in the form of no-knock warrant bill, a no-knock warrant bill, rather, that did actually pass into legislation. And finally, non-repetition and a kind of system, if you will, for ensuring that the harms did not occur again, that specific harm of entering through the no-knock warrant and then the resulting death. So again, just kind of with a broad stroke, I wanted to offer a different account of public safety connected with, again, this reparative justice framework, to speak sort of generally for all abolitionist groups, but to really talk about how they're conceptualizing and thinking through and actually using that framework to advocate for a set of policies that I think there might be agreement in this room on, deserve to be acknowledged and pursued. All right, thank you all for your time.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the last panel, I will try to talk loud and be somewhat informative for you. First of all, thank you very much to the Heritage Foundation and Berkeley Law for putting on this presentation. You know, I've spent almost the last 3 decades prosecuting cases in federal court and state court, so this is something very near and dear to me, public safety and keeping our communities safe. So thank you very much for this invitation. A prosecutor's job is to protect the public and keep communities safe. I'd argue that a modern day prosecutor is also a problem solver and must use all available tools and resources to protect the public. And one of those tools and resources is working with law enforcement in the investigation and prosecution of those that break criminal laws. A prosecutor in every case should seek to make sure that the victim is protected, the community is safe, and the offender, while held accountable, is put in the best position to not reoffend. And that's important, put in the best position to not reoffend. And I'll talk about that a little more, but when we look at recidivism rates, what do we do? If you want to talk about public safety, there's a couple different things you can do. You can lock somebody up. While they're locked up, they're not committing crimes outside the prison, except very rarely where they're kind of organizing some organized crime stuff, but they're not committing crimes outside the prison. But 99% of the people that get locked up are going to get out. So if we let them out into that same environment with no changes and think that their actions will change, silly for us to think that. So when we look at recidivism rates, what can we put in place to put those individuals in the best position to not reoffend? So quick side note, I want to cover a couple things that were talked about in the other panels. So one is when looking at the prosecution of minor offenses or misdemeanor offenses. I think one of the presenters talked about, well, we have to make sure we divert resources to prosecuting the violent crimes. As prosecutors, I've done it. We can walk and chew gum too. We can prosecute the minor crimes. We can prosecute the major crimes. We can keep our communities safe. I'd argue that those minor crimes, whether it be retail theft, disorderly conduct, minor drug offenses, need to be prosecuted, need to be handled by the prosecutors and by law enforcement. Because if you let those minor crimes remain unchecked, they will progress into more dangerous, more violent crimes. Much like a parent who tries to steer their kids, and I'm a parent of two adult daughters now, but try to steer their kids away from destructive actions, society has guardrails for the protection of its citizens. Those are criminal laws that need to be enforced. And when they're not, then you see what happens around the country. Oftentimes, these individuals committing these, what we would say are minor crimes, retail thefts, disorderly conduct, other arguably minor crimes, have drug addiction, have mental illness, have those other reasons or root causes why they're committing those crimes, they can be addressed. It's an avenue to get them out of that criminal behavior. And it's more tools for prosecutors to use. It doesn't mean lock up all those individuals, but it means get them the help they need. The other topic I want to talk about that was addressed earlier was talking about longer prison sentences, reducing less recidivism. I talked about recidivism earlier. So, and the research is pretty clear from the Federal Sentencing Commission, and it says that for comparably the same offenses, a longer prison sentence results in less recidivism than a shorter prison sentence. And I'll tell you the kind of practical effect of that right now in Illinois. So I'm a state's attorney in Illinois, and recently, you probably read about it in the news, with our no cash bail, our Safety Act, where there is no cash bail anymore, which is fine. I mean, whether you're locked up shouldn't depend on how much money you have, right? It's whether you're a danger to the public. That's what should matter. Because of it, though, all around, there are 102 counties in Illinois. Every single county has seen a reduction in those in prison because the judges are not keeping them, because under the new statute, certain crimes, especially property crimes, they will not detain those individuals. So because of that, much less people in prison. Now, what's that going to mean? That's going to mean less individuals pleading guilty. Why is that? Because when somebody sits in prison before a plea, and now 96% of the cases when somebody is charged, 96% of those cases somebody pleads guilty. It doesn't go to trial. They will not plead guilty to a short prison sentence because they don't have that built up credit time served. There are going to be more people on community-based sentences or probation. I hope it works. I hope that community-based sentence works and it's safe for the community. I fear it might not be. And if it's not, then a longer sentence for those that violate probation is what is needed in those cases. As indicated, I spent years as the elected DA, and then I was the U.S. attorney. Now I'm back as the elected DA. I understand the important role that our federal law enforcement plays in keeping our community safe. Federal partners play an important role. But where the rubber meets the road and the bulk of the heavy lifting for keeping our communities safe is state and local prosecutors and state and local law enforcement. Over 85% of law enforcement in this country is state and local. Those are the individuals, almost 2,400 of them, that run prosecutors' offices around the country that are on the front lines working with law enforcement to keep communities safe. And they need to work with law enforcement to get that done. Last year, a group of former U.S. attorneys and DAs started what is called the American Center for Law and Public Safety to address the question of what is a responsible prosecutor. Important question. We're kind of talking about it today. We have a responsible prosecutor. What is the definition of that? I don't know. It's interesting. So we started talking about it. Okay, and this is Democrats, Republicans, and I know some people touched on this. This is a nonpartisan, apolitical issue. If you're a prosecutor, you are apolitical, doing the right thing, and partisan politics can't play a part in what you do or any of the decisions you make as a prosecutor. So we started looking, okay, what are some core principles? And we came up with five that we would say, five core principles that a responsible, effective prosecutor has. One is collaborate with law enforcement. You have to work with law enforcement. They're on the front lines. As a prosecutor, you have to work with law enforcement. Number two, respect for the rule of law. I live in Illinois. I don't always personally agree with the legislation that comes out of the state capitol, but as the prosecutor, I have to follow that law. I understand there's 3 branches of government, and I will follow the law. I will do so also and protect the public as much as I can as state's attorney. Another one, support victims' rights. Support victims' rights. As a prosecutor, victims are, while we don't represent them, we represent everybody in the community. They're an important part of what we do in bringing them justice, bringing them closure, helping them navigate the process, whether it be having to come testify or hold their hand and discuss what happened to a loved one when they were killed by a drunk driver or when they were sexually assaulted and killed. That's the job of a prosecutor, and support victims. Support re-entry programs for offenders. And that's an important one. We talk about recidivism. So 99% of the people that get locked up are going to get out. As a prosecutor, you need to support those re-entry programs. And you need to work with community partners. Sure, I can't do it in the Sangamon County State's Attorney's Office. Law enforcement can't do it. But working together and finding those community partners that we can work with, by doing that, we can make our community a safer place. And you must prioritize public safety. A prosecutor has to prioritize public safety, number one, and what they do to keep the community safe. A responsible prosecutor works with the police. They have to. They have to work with law enforcement for that ultimate goal of public safety. And many people have mentioned that a prosecutor is the gatekeeper to the criminal justice system. And they're working hand in hand with law enforcement. They're the gatekeepers to the criminal justice system. Police are a necessary and important part of the equation in keeping communities safe. And communities safe and helping people. So we've heard this has been in the news, that it's difficult to hire law enforcement. Well, I'll tell you, it's also difficult to hire prosecutors. It's difficult to hire in all sorts of employment, but when we're looking at hiring prosecutors, I go to job fairs. I was at Northwestern University a couple weeks ago at a public service job fair, and I would go around and say, who wants to be a state court prosecutor? They kind of look not that excited. I kind of changed my approach. I said, who wants to help people and keep their communities safe? A lot more excitement, because a lot of people want to do that. There is a whole host of individuals out there that want to help people and keep communities safe. They just don't know all the different places they can do it. One's being a prosecutor, one's being a police officer or another law enforcement, but there's so many other ways that they can help people. A teacher. I went and spoke to a group of superintendents, of principals, saying, look, we're in the same business of helping people and keeping our community safe. Because we know, research tells us that if we can keep somebody in school and they can graduate from high school, not only does their chance of getting involved in the criminal justice system lower, but if they are involved, that recidivism goes down. We know that. We know that if we can get them into some sort of college and trade school, it goes down more. If we can get them to graduate from college or a trade school, it goes from 60% if you don't graduate from high school to 20% if we can get them through college or a trade school. Right there. And so the argument to the teachers that, hey, we are in the same line of work in keeping our communities safe. And prosecutors must work with law enforcement, and they must work with other individuals in the community to keep the community safe. You know, one thing I learned, and it's interesting, when I was state's attorney for years before I became U.S. attorney, I thought I knew everything about prosecuting cases. And then I came back after the partnerships, after working at the U.S. Attorney's Office, after working at DOJ, and realized that we need so many more people involved in the system and what we're doing as prosecutors and working with law enforcement to bring them in to the tent to keep our communities safe. And we can be as creative as we want to be. You know, 30 years ago, if I would have said drug court or diversion or mental health court or veterans court, those were new things. Now they're old hat. And almost every jurisdiction has that. But what else can we do to be creative in the criminal justice arena, in working with the police and giving them the tools they need to keep our communities safe? Vilifying them is not the answer. They are a necessary part of the equation, and bringing them into the fold and working with them and giving them the tools they need to keep our community safe is vital. It's a basic human right to live in a safe community, and we can only have safe communities if we have responsible prosecutors who work with the police. Thank you very much.
Can I just make one observation and pose a question that maybe we could have for discussion after the next two speakers go forth? It's just that, so Jamelia, when you had your vision and laid out the views of many people in the abolitionist movement and non-prosecution, interestingly, even for the officers who murdered Breonna Taylor, they had a vision of what should happen with some reconciliation and some way of changing the individuals who did the killing. And John, I hear some of the same approaches from you. I mean, that is, you're not in favor of locking people up again and again and again unless something changes with them, whether there are some programs in place, something to assure that they don't violate the law again if released, or at least reduce the likelihood of that happening. And so one question to have, perhaps after we've heard all the speakers, and maybe some of the other speakers might want to address this too, is there a way to reduce harm in a fashion that will accomplish some real change that both those who are abolitionists who may think of this as a way station may accept or honor in some fashion, and that law enforcement may think would be really productive? At least that's a question that I'd like to pose. And with that, I'll shut up. Please.
Hi, everyone. 5 p.m. on Friday. Thank you for being here. So this is, I'll just start by saying this is kind of my first experience with this kind of debate. I normally work directly with communities that are working to kind of resist the status quo or defending themselves from its harm, not sort of debating it in this manner, especially in law school, or at least sort of since I was in law school. And in preparing for today and thinking about what it means to be kind of debating criminal justice, especially in the setting of a law school, my mind was drawn to the figure of August Vollmer. Is that a name people here know? Professor Simon, I guess, knows. So Vollmer was a police chief here in Berkeley from 1909 to 1923, and then he was LAPD chief after that. He also founded and led UC Berkeley's criminal justice program, which was hailed as sort of the first kind of academic study of criminal justice in the United States, and sort of the origins of kind of academic study of criminology. So in a sense, I think he founded the tradition that we're a part of today, that we're continuing today in this sort of academic kind of scientific, in a sense, study of criminal justice. Vollmer was also celebrated as the kind of father of modern policing and police reform. His biography is titled The Father of American Policing, and that's largely for his work, both in Berkeley and with LAPD, kind of in academic settings of sort of professionalizing policing, treating policing as something that needs to be the product of training, of kind of curriculum, prioritizing education, and treating it as kind of a more, again, scientific kind of enterprise. Vollmer was also a eugenicist. His police curriculum, those training curriculums taught topics like the generation of the races and the origin of races. He was kind of head of all these sort of eugenicist societies, and that's often kind of framed as a contradiction. Like, how could it be that the father of police reform was also a eugenicist? And I don't think it's a contradiction if you sort of distill it down to what eugenics was, beyond just kind of a notion of biological, kind of cartoonish biological racism. More than that, I think eugenics was an effort to reframe what are political questions about why it is that we have disparate treatment of different races in our society, why are there different kind of social outcomes for different races, trying to reframe those political choices and political questions into scientific ones, treating them as something that is just due to a lack of kind of enough expertise or kind of technocratic problem. More than that, it was an effort to really, eugenics was an effort to sort of calibrate these systems of racial violence, to try to say that there's a kind of optimal balance that can be achieved between, oh, this is too much racial violence for its trade-offs, or this is okay, this is acceptable given what we're achieving, kind of a cost-benefit type of approach to thinking about how much racial violence is okay versus whatever benefits you're getting. And I think it's important to recognize that tradition when sitting in rooms like today, because unfortunately, throughout history, there's been a lot of rooms like this of sort of highly educated, mostly wealthy people gathering to discuss how we can refine and calibrate the criminal justice system. And I think especially for the law students in the room, which are fewer than I thought it would be, the law students in the room, it's important to think about that as you think about kind of, how you want to involve yourselves in those political struggles. People with personal experience with the criminal justice system often observe that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And I think that's deeply true in a sense. It's also true that we're very close to the problem here. The problem being that these political questions of criminal justice have often been reduced into sort of a technocratic question of again, like sort of finding the right exact optimal balance of the system rather than recognizing these are political choices and they always have been. So I'll start with an example of that from my work. So since 2019, for about 5 years now, I've been working with this group called the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. It's based in Skid Row. Our work is sort of confronting police surveillance and data technologies, including in particular what's called predictive policing, which is kind of innovation that refers to harvesting of mass data to select both people and places that will be targeted for heightened policing. When predictive policing began to spread early in the 2010s, it was promoted kind of in a bipartisan manner as a way of making policing better and more objective, depending on what your flavor is. From the sort of the progressive angle was it's going to eliminate racial bias, it's going to kind of replace the subjective biases of policing with sort of, of individual officers with sort of, a more refined objective approach. And on the other side, on the sort of, if your approach is sort of reducing the costs of policing and making it more efficient, that was how it was promoted in that way. 10 years later, in 2019 and 2020, LA's first kind of, there are these two programs. I'm not going to get into details, but they're both ended in response to kind of community opposition and audits and exposing kind of their harm. I don't have time to get into all the sort of the details of that, but I want to highlight kind of two postmortem points about the programs. One is an audit of by LAPD's Inspector General revealed that around half of the people targeted under this program labeled chronic offenders and subject to kind of relentless police harassment and monitoring and surveillance on the basis of that label were black. Half of them were black in a city that's less than 10% black. So, I know people in this room might say, well, that's because the black people were doing all the crimes. And the audit disproved that too, establishing that a fifth of the people that this kind of data-driven program had labeled as chronic offenders had zero prior contact with police of any kind, and most of them had very little. So, what that shows us is that, even this program that was billed as this is going to reduce disparities and it's going to reduce kind of the human, like, old-fashioned racism, has instead kind of reproduced those in many ways. And I think, I bring that up. There's more grim details like that I can share. There are also these kind of locations that were targeted for policing and labeled kind of hotspot zones. All of, maybe I'll say those details, but there's sort of, a lot has come out about kind of the disparities of killings and other violence in those areas. But I just want to highlight this example mainly to ask, what comes next? Like, if there was this sort of effort to replace the sort of subjective, old-fashioned racism of policing with kind of objective scientific approaches, and that just ended up reproducing, if not worsening, the same kind of harms, what do we do then? Is the idea, okay, we should go back to the old-fashioned kind of racism of the past, or is it, I think, that's where the case for abolition begins, showing that even these efforts to improve policing, this kind of constant efforts to reform it over the last 100 whatever years, going back to August Vollmer, that all that's done is made a system worse, because you can't fix a system that's doing exactly what it was intended. And so that, I think, is the start of the case for abolition. That gets to kind of the third point I want to make. I'll try to make this one quick, which is Skid Row. Skid Row, where I work, is a site of concentrated poverty. It's probably, it's similar to the Tenderloin here and other neighborhoods. It's also historically been a site of the most concentrated policing in Los Angeles, more police and patrols and enforcement and tickets than anywhere else in the city. And so concentrated site of poverty, concentrated site of policing. And LA is now expanding sort of the approach that has, its approach to Skid Row citywide with a kind of citywide criminalization strategy that depends on an ordinance that criminalizes sleeping or sitting outside, or sitting or sleeping, lying, or sitting in public space, which I think, there's ordinances like this in a lot of places. Last week, there was a report that leaked from the City-County Homeless Services Authority, kind of diving into it's one agency's kind of impact or study of the impact of that strategy, and what the conclusion was that the law has largely been a disaster in terms of actually, removing people from the streets and actually providing housing. Instead, people cleared from encampments, cycle back into the streets pretty quickly, always with less resources and stability that they began with. Among thousands of people who were displaced in this way since 2021 when the strategy launched, only 2 have been housed, 2. So the Supreme Court this term is going to decide a case that, the Eighth Amendment case about whether it's constitutional to criminalize people for sleeping outside when there's no other place to sleep. That's going to be it's the case. It's the City of Grants Pass case. But to bring the question back into this room, I want to ask, lawyers can debate that legal question, but at some point, the question that we should be asking is, how do we discuss whether providing housing is going to do more for public safety than this kind of strategy, legal or not, of criminalizing housing? Because if policing meant more public safety, then Skid Row would be the safest place in the country. The United States would be the safest country in the world, where there's more concentration of policing than anywhere else. But the safest neighborhoods in our cities are safest not because they have the most police, it's because they have the most resources. What distinguishes public safety in a place like Skid Row from a place like Beverly Hills is not their relative amount of policing, but it's their wealth. And specifically, a greater share of the wealth in a place like Beverly Hills is going to the things that actually keep people safe. A smaller share is going to policing than, for example, to Beverly Hills High School, or to homes, or to parks, or to civic life. The poorer you are, the more the government is spending on policing you versus on any other sort of social services and resources. In LA, roughly half of the city budget over the past 10 years, the discretionary budget that the city council votes on each year has gone to police, to LAPD. That's half, every other dollar. And so when people are demanding sort of divesting from policing, when they're talking about defunding and they're talking about abolition in favor of investments that actually improve public safety, that's the starting point. That what does it mean to actually provide the things that ensure safety rather than sort of trying to criminalize our way out of these problems?
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me and for sticking around to the end of the day. Hopefully, you all are taking away some valuable things from this exchange, which I really appreciate being a part of. So the prompt that we were given is, how do we conceptualize public safety and sort of what role does policing play in that? So, when I think about public safety, what I'm really talking about is the degree to which people are secure in their persons and in their property within a polity. In short, public safety is a public good, and not just a public good, it is the public good. It is the thing that our governments in this country were created to provide, right? I mean, straight out of Federalist 51, if all men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? There was a sort of formative recognition. So how does the government go about providing this particular public good? I mean, well, we make laws, right? We detect and prove out violations of those laws. Then we punish the violators of those laws. And the punishment of those violations serves 4 penological ends, one of which is deterrence, another is incapacitation. Then there's rehabilitation and retribution. Where does policing come in? Policing kind of comes in sort of in the middle of the process, right? Police don't make the laws, but they come in at the front end of the enforcement process. And they really kind of have 2 broad roles in this country. One is to detect violations of the law, and the other is to prevent violations of the law, right? Sort of going back to the days of Robert Peel, the sort of actual godfather of modern policing and founder of the Metropolitan Police Department in London, right? The true job of police is to detect and prevent both crime and disorder. So how do police go about detecting crime? It's pretty straightforward. They investigate based on suspicion, they respond to citizen calls for service, and when they develop probable cause, they make an arrest, at which point responsibility shifts to other criminal justice actors. Now, how do police prevent crime? That's a more interesting question, and I think they do so in two main ways. One is through their mere presence. Right? Police deter those in their vicinity from committing crimes. A really good example of this that I think a lot of people in the room will be familiar with. You're driving down the highway, you see a state trooper up ahead on the shoulder. What do? You slow down, right? The research actually bears this out.
And you try not to let them see your brake lights.
That's right, yeah. You try to slow down in time, right? Or you just get down to about 10 miles over and hope that they let you go. And the research bears this out pretty well. There's one really interesting study that I always like to talk about. John McDonald out of the University of Pennsylvania led it. They did a natural experiment where they expanded the patrol sector of the University of Pennsylvania police outside the campus, and what they found were significant declines in crime in the adjacent blocks. Another really famous study on this was done by Jonathan Click and Alex Tabarrok, which utilized a really cool natural experiment in Washington, D.C. just after 9/11, where the police presence along the National Mall was determined in large part by the terror alert threat level, which was changing day to day. So you had these really cool situations where the amount of police out on the National Mall was determined by something that was essentially unpredictable, and they were able to look at what the effect on crime was, not just along the National Mall, but also in adjacent blocks, and found pretty significant declines. There's some later research that showed that there was some displacement effect, but it still speaks to the deterrent effect of police presence in a public place. The other way that police prevent crime, though, is by removing criminal actors from the street. And I just want to take a moment here to divert, because I think one sort of big point of contention throughout the conversations that have occurred throughout the day is whether police actually do reduce crime. Right? This is, I think, a point of contention, and there's been a lot of assertions that there's really no evidence to support this claim. And so I just wanted to go over a few of the studies in this space. Aaron Chalfin and Justin McCrary found that for every additional dollar spent on policing in 2010 compared to the prior year, there was $1.63 return that was mostly from declines in homicides. Morgan Williams and Aaron Chalfin in the American Economic Review found that the addition of 1 police officer abates 0.1 homicides, meaning that additional 10 police officers abates 1 homicide per year, and that the effects were twice as large in the black community. Jonathan McDonald, Click, and Grunwald, I just mentioned that study about the expansion of police patrols outside the University of Pennsylvania. You have Vidal and Kirkmeyer in 2018 looking at the addition of 1 additional police response officer in Manchester, England, finding that the hiring of 1 additional officer pays not just the entire payroll cost, but 170% of the payroll cost of that additional officer, again, mostly in the form of crime declines. You have Mello in 2018 finds a 3.2% increase in policing is associated with a 3.5% reduction in victimization costs. Again, Alex Tabarrok and Jonathan Click in 2005, a 15% decline in crime on affected blocks in D.C. Was associated with the higher terror alert levels. Jonathan McDonald, Jeffrey Fagan, and Weller assessed the effect of Operation Impact in New York City, finding that from 2004 to 2012, the areas where that operation took place saw sharp reductions in total crime and in every single index crime category. You have Roland Fryer and Tanaya Devi in 2020, finding that sharp increases in crime came as a result of the increase in federal pattern and practice investigations that followed viral police incidents that were mostly a function of reductions in police proactivity. So the idea that there isn't evidence that police reduce crime is just wrong. There is a lot of evidence, and it makes a lot of sense, particularly when you think about the incapacitation effect that I was just starting to talk about, right? If a police officer makes an arrest and removes an active offender from the street, right, if that's somebody who is committing 10, 20, 30 felonies a year, well, then that individual being in custody spares the community the crimes that would have otherwise been committed. But this is where the sort of broader criminal justice system is implicated, because the expected benefits of a police enforcement action are diminished when prosecutors don't prosecute, when pretrial detention plummets, when post-conviction imprisonment rates fall through the floor, right? You have to grapple with the reality that the serious crime problem in this country that exists, and we do have a serious crime problem, is driven mostly by repeat offenders, individuals who've had multiple bites at the apple. In the city of Chicago, the typical homicide and shooting suspect has 12 prior arrests. 1 in 5 have 20 prior arrests. Right? These are not individuals who are just being locked up for a first offense and having the key thrown away. In the city of Oakland, a 2014 problem analysis looked at homicide suspects in that city and found that on average they have 10 prior arrests. Same number in Baltimore. Right? Nationally, there was a study done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics looking at the 75 largest counties in the United States between 1990 and 2002, and over that period, 36% of convicted violent felons were either out on pretrial release, parole, or probation at the time of those offenses. There is a serious risk associated with the repeat offender problem, and that risk is not evenly distributed. Why? Because crime is not evenly distributed. It is a hyper-concentrated phenomenon, both geographically and demographically. Am I at 10 minutes? Oh, okay, all right. And I want to really, really home in on that point because, if you look at any analysis of a city in this country, what you're going to find is that a very, very tiny share of street segments account for a really, really large chunk of the crime. In my home city of New York, about 3.5% of our 80,000 or so street segments see about 50% of all the violence. 1% of the street segments see about 25% of all the violence. And it's not evenly distributed demographically. And again, in my home city of New York, from 2008 to 2022, a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims were either black or Latino. We do not constitute 95% of New York City's population. We never have. Okay? In some years, that's a minimum, by the way. In some years, it's as high as 98%, at which point it might as well be 100. Right? And this takes me to another important point that I think has kind of been left out of the discussion today, which is this idea of racial disparities kind of in the enforcement statistics bearing out or constituting some kind of prima facie evidence of racism or discrimination built into the system. And I think that's wrong for a couple of reasons, but I think the biggest reason is that it ignores what I call the other side of the ledger. It's focused on enforcement actions as if those are the only outputs of the criminal justice system. But I just went through a pretty big handful of studies showing just the effect that policing has on crime. And those were only a couple. There were a couple others that I didn't cite. But you don't have to take my word for it. I want to quote a scholar who's not here, although I think he would have been a good addition. His name's Patrick Sharkey. He's a scholar at Princeton University and the author of a really interesting book called Uneasy Peace, wherein he advocates for a move away from policing and incarceration. So this is a very progressive reform advocate. And I just want to quote what he said in the Washington Post, I think about a year and a half ago. He says, quote, "The best evidence we have makes clear that police are effective in reducing crime." He goes on, quote, "One of the most robust, most uncomfortable, for him, not for me, findings in criminology is that putting more officers on the street leads to less violent crime. Not only does it lead to less violent crime, but it leads to less violent crime in the parts of this country where violent crime is most pronounced." I went to law school in the city of Chicago, which is where my wife's originally from. She's from the West Side, a neighborhood called Humboldt Park, which is consistently plagued with a lot of serious violence. I looked at the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in 2019 in that city. Collectively, that year, they had a collective homicide rate of 61 per 100,000. The homicide rate in the United States that year was 5 per 100,000. If you just broke out the most dangerous neighborhood in Chicago in 2019, it was a place called West Garfield Park. That year, the homicide rate in West Garfield Park, which is about 95% black and Latino, was 131 per 100,000, which basically puts it on par with any of the battlefields that our Marines fought in Iraq and Afghanistan at the height of those conflicts. Now, I say that because I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a mother who's sending her 19-year-old son off to the Marines in 2003. Think about the fear that she would feel about whether or not her son's going to come home from that conflict, knowing that he's going to war. Now, understand that at a time of peace in this country, there are mothers who take the same chance with their sons' lives every day simply by sending them to school. Okay? So, when you talk about racial disparities, you have to understand that there is a cost to crime. And when we have institutions like police, like prosecutors, like carceral systems that reduce crime by taking active offenders off the street, the benefits associated with those crime reductions are just as unevenly distributed as the costs associated with the operation of a robust criminal justice system. And if you're going to do a faithful analysis of racial disparities in the system, you have to look at that side of the ledger too. And I'm going to end here with an analysis, again, done by Patrick Sharkey and a co-author, where he looked at the effect of the homicide decline from 1990 to 2014, where it declined about 50% in this country. And he looked at the effect of that decline on life expectancy by race. What he found was that that decline in homicides added about 0.14 years of life expectancy for the average white man in this country, which is not nothing, right? That is substantial. It added a full year of life expectancy to the average black man's life. Now, there is debate about the degree to which that crime decline was a result of the buildup of incarceration and the more aggressive policing tactics engaged in throughout the 90s, but there is very, very little debate that both of those institutions produced at least some of that decline, right? Some of the low-end estimates of the effect of the incarceration buildup, like William Spellman, say it's about 25% of that homicide decline was attributable to incarceration. You have people like Stephen Levitt who would put it higher at about 45%. Right? But both policing and incarceration played a role. And even, it's also important to understand that the people at the helm of the criminal justice system, police chiefs, law and order prosecutors, also believe that it played a role. They believe that they are reducing crime. And so then the question becomes, well, why on earth would the people operating a system that we're told is allegedly designed and operated for the specific oppression of low-income minority communities do something that they believe is going to disproportionately benefit those communities? Right? When homicides decline 50%, it's not rich white people that are going to benefit. That's just reality. And yet that is what is being pursued by the law and order prosecutors. That is what is being pursued by the police chiefs. That is what is being pursued by the advocates for a more responsible approach to criminal justice. The idea that we can produce those benefits by getting at the root causes of crime, assuming that we understand what they are, requires us to believe that we are somehow going to solve some of society's most intractable problems. Problems that have characterized every human society that has ever existed anywhere in the world. No one's ever figured out how to eliminate poverty. No one's ever figured out how to eliminate inequality. No one's ever figured out how to eliminate crime or predation. All right? It is part of the human condition. It will always be with us. The idea that we have suddenly figured out something that no human before us has ever figured out is hubris. And the idea that we should roll the dice with the lives of people who are living in some of our most vulnerable communities by taking away the institutions that have been proven to produce real benefits in the form of crime declines is, in my opinion, irresponsible. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes, I think. We started pretty late. So let me first give panelists an opportunity to respond to each other, and then I'd really like to leave some time to open up for questions from the audience.
I could start with a little bit of response. Especially sort of, I wanted the last presentation. I'm trying to grapple with the way you ended of just the idea that poverty will always be with us. That is the world we live in and it always will be. And that's kind of, I don't know, it's sort of, to me, that really, I think, highlights the idea that abolitionists are the hopeful ones, that we actually do believe that a world without poverty is possible, that that can be built, and that is at least worth prioritizing. Because, I mean, even the racial, and I think this leads to the point about the racial disparities, is that, critics of the system say that it's got these racial disparities, like you noted, and then the response, is that, well, those racial disparities reflect the incidence of crime. And that's why we see them. Well, I mean, why is there the racial disparities in the incidence of crime in the first place? It's obviously, is it because Black and Latino people are just more into crime or they love crime? No, it's because of other socioeconomic and structural factors that create that, racial misdistribution of crime in the first place. And so...
Well, can I stop you there? Sure. Just because it's a point of agreement. I actually agree that there are some structural reasons that explain why those disparities exist. And no, I obviously don't think that there's something inherently wrong with people like me who have brown skin and have African roots. But I think one of the structures is the family. I was a recent co-author on a study looking at crime rates at both at the county level for counties that were above and below the median for a share of households headed by a single parent. And then we homed in on the city of Chicago and looked at census tracts, both above and below the median share of households headed by a single parent. And what we found in the city of Chicago with it, in the census tracts that were above the median share of households headed by a single parent, overall crime was about 100% higher. Violent crime specifically was about 200% higher than the ones below the median, and homicide was about 400% higher than the ones below the median. And then the question becomes, well, why might this be? And I think that there's actually a pretty good body of literature, and particularly in the sociological and psychology space, showing that adverse childhood experiences are much more likely to come about in unstable family structures. There's less supervision, there's more stress, there's less economic support. And so when you have significant racial disparities in family structure formation, right, 7 out of 10 kids in the African American community in this country are born to an unwed mother, I think that's going to manifest itself in the crime statistics insofar as being born into that kind of family structure is associated with the experience of adversity in early childhood that we know is associated with the development of things like antisocial personality disorder, which, you know, are much more prominent in prison settings than they are in the general population, right? And the general population of men, which are, you know, most prisoners in this country, the general population of men in the U.S., antisocial personality disorder has a prevalence rate of about 2 to 4%. In prison settings, depending on the institution that you're looking at, it ranges from 40 to 70%. Right, and what's a predecessor? What's a precursor to that? It's childhood conduct disorders. And what are the biggest predicting factors of childhood conduct disorders? All the things that are present in broken families and families that in households where there's a lot of stress and a lot of economic instability. So, you know, it's not that I think that there's something inherent about these communities. I think there's a structural analysis to be had. It's just a different one from you.
Yeah, well, and even the structural, and if you want to jump in, even if we accept that, yes, it's sort of this kind of the kind of inherent or just broken families and less representation of fathers, if that's what, you know, it's hard to also separate that from the institution of incarceration, creating that to some extent. And even deeper than that, I think it's impossible to separate that from the fact that breaking black families as the like founding kind of like institution in this country from the very like from that's the history of the black experience, obviously, from the founding of this country, is to separate and break families, and it's hard. It's going to be hard always to separate that from whatever effects you're describing.
I think that's right, but if I can just quickly respond by just saying, like, you know, the idea that it's in intention to both, you know, accept a role of robust incarceration, but at the same time talk about the families. You have to understand these aren't the same families we're talking about, right? The idea is that you don't want to expose kids to antisocial parents. So the question becomes is there reason to believe that the typical person who gets incarcerated falls into that antisocial category? Again, I think the statistics on the prevalence of antisocial personality disorder in prison settings suggest that there's, you know, pretty good evidence to say that it might actually be more harmful on net to expose a kid to a criminal parent, which is why I don't think there's a real tension there.
Some of these labels aren't necessarily objective, though, Rafael. I think in a way, like the antisocial personality disorder label, there's been, you know, extensive critique on the kind of racial bias that's imbued in the actual DSM itself, right? So there's a critique of that. And then I also think, I think the ACE's point is a good one, but I do agree that it's hard to disentangle. I mean, Dorothy Roberts has demonstrated, you know, 1 in 2 black children have some exposure to the child welfare system. Does anyone have experience with the child welfare system as a child or as a parent? Okay. And so in many ways, I think that, you know, we can think about these, again, if it's the frame of soft policing, the child welfare system is involved in the lives of many black families or family structures, not just the sort of nuclear family structure. And I think that effort to police families in kind of punitive ways and not provide them with resources is also kind of connected to what many abolitionists are saying is just too much enforcement and resources in the policing end and not so much on the treatment and the resource non-punitive end. And I think when we think about like the benefits and costs, kind of to your earlier point, Chuck, I think our definition of cost is still too narrow. Like I think that the cost of policing have to be grappled with along with a kind of a recognition that in many ways, for every study that we show where, yeah, police are effective, what are the other metrics that we're using to discern the cost on communities? And I'm not, again, when we use arrest as a proxy for the effectiveness of people, an arrest is not a conviction, right? We know that. So the arrest can't be the proxy for effectiveness. That might be just, demonstrating that you have an ineffective program of, maybe it's the shot spotter or whatever. So I guess that was one of the reactions I had. It's like the metrics that we're using are certainly different, and I'm not sure they're as objective as we think they are.
I just argue when you look at communities, and this is not an overnight fix. So you look where we are right now with communities and their distrust for the police. One thing I did when I was U.S. Attorney, we started a program called BLAST, which is Building Lasting Relationships Between the Community and the Police, where I would bring in high school age kids and college age kids, and we would have different scenarios. So there was a shooting simulator where they would, have a fake gun and a screen, go through an actual demonstration of what the police have to decide. I had 911 calls, actual 911 calls, where they would listen. This is all the information the police have when they go to a call. We do a lot of domestic violence calls because those are dangerous calls for the police. We had one on the law. We had one with a therapy dog. In our office, a big component is working with the victims, and part of it was to allow the interaction of these folks in the community that might have never talked to the police in a not adversarial situation, to allow them to talk to them. And I know it was universally liked by not only the kids that went through it, but also the police, that they got to talk to these kids and understand some of the concerns they have when they have to deal with them, and they feel like they're being harassed. Also the kids, when they're talking to the police, saying, hey, they're just normal people too. Right, and they're talking in this non-adversarial position. So I think that's pretty important when you look at these communities. And again, it's not an overnight fix, but it's that conversation that has to take place because the police are a necessary component of keeping communities safe. And unfortunately, we talk about this kind of big group in the middle that we're trying to help, we put on probation, and we hope they stop committing criminal behavior. But there is a small percentage of the sort of incorrigible 1% that when they're out, they're going to commit violent crimes, and we need the police out there to protect us. So there is that group, and there's this big group in the middle that we hope we can change their criminal behavior. But the police are a necessary part of keeping communities safe.
Let me just pose one thing and then open it up, and that is that in some ways we're talking extremes, or at least some of this conversation has been. One is, police are really effective, and studies sort of show that in reducing some homicide rates in particular places. Well, you could really show they're effective if you have an officer every 20 feet, right? So there's a question of scale and how one deploys resources. And so between the extremes of officers every 20 feet and no police at all, I'm kind of interested in a couple of things, like what is an appropriate footprint for police, both in terms of the numbers and the duties that they have. How intensely do you want to police particular communities? And John's comments kind of go to that, in that there are ways to interact with communities that are not as part of the sort of strict crime investigation function, but help build trust in some way. I mean, what model do we really sort of want, assuming that tomorrow won't be a world with no police at all, and tomorrow won't be a world with officers every 20 feet? So what do we want that to look like? And another question that's part of that is, we talk about arrest and conviction, and then there's sentencing. And I know that a number of speakers today have talked about sentencing commission studies, about recidivism and such. I read a number of those studies to say that the older people get, the less risk they are of recidivism. And I worry about particularly California's version of a 3 strikes and 2 strikes law that increases sentences kind of exponentially, if you will, when a person has a prior record. And I wonder whether we are over-incarcerating there too, and whether we found the right balance. So I'm kind of interested in where the balance ought to be.
I can start with the last part, which is that, it's certainly the case that the recidivism data, which is pretty atrocious, right? I mean, the state prison population recidivates at a rate of 83% over a 10-year period on average. Those individuals are going to generate 5 rearrests over that period, which of course only understates the degree of crime that they're actually committing, because most crime doesn't get reported, and most crime that gets reported doesn't result in an arrest. So it's really only a fraction of the recidivism problem that's captured there. And it's true that the recidivism rate does go down with age pretty significantly, but it's also important to understand that it never zeroes out. The state prison recidivism data is broken down by, I think, 10-year age cohorts, but for 65 and over, it stops. But even for 65 and over, it's still like 25%, which is not nothing. Again, that's not to say that every elderly person should be kept in prison, but it's also, we have to understand what the realities are of that, who goes to prison, how old they are, how long they tend to stay. We talk a lot about really long sentences, and, I understand that, but the reality is that's not the prototypical case, right? The median amount of time served in state prison, which is where about 9 out of every 10 prisoners are housed, is 16 months. That's not a very long time. Right? Even if you just disaggregate, by category and just look at the violent crime convicts, it's only 2.5 years for the people who are convicted of violent crime. Right? There was something in one of the prior panels that talked about the sort of degree to which you can affect perception by really homing in on the viral stories that get a lot of attention. Well, I think this is a perfect example of that. Right? This is where we kind of focus on these radical cases of, that one guy who his first offense and he got 30 years and this sucks, or he did something at 19, but that was his second strike, and then at 50 he, gets a DUI and now he's going away for life. Those are so far and few between. So I think it's important to try and identify the places where we over-incarcerate, i.e. to recognize that there's some subset of the prison population that doesn't belong there, and we should seek to secure their releases. I'm fine with that. But we also have to understand that there is a population of offenders on the street today, individuals with 10, 20, 30, 40 prior arrests who are still active, who belong in prison but are not there. Right? And when we fail to put them in there, we're leaving communities at risk. And now I'm forgetting what the first part was, but I'll stop there because I don't want to.
Please, others.
But again, that data point of arrest, again, and some of the data points, and as to the recidivism sort of data metrics that we use, it's often not the same arrest for the same crime that got the person in there. So that's important to note. And then again, the problem with the kind of arrest as a proxy for actual criminality from the standpoint of at least that framework. And then again, the cost, like 16 months. What happens to your life if you just are incarcerated for 16 months, you haven't paid your rent, your job is looking for you. So I think in a way, again, we're trying to, assuming they were employed, but that's disruptive too. And so I think we have to, I think the earlier comments from the panel, we have to, focus more on what the day-to-day harms of incarceration are. And shy away from maybe the extreme stories, although they matter themselves. But I do think that if we're trying to find a common ground here, one of the things that comes to mind is just like the way that we're talking about it, like the data points are different. Throughout the day, we have different frameworks, and I am learning a lot in like how to rethink some of the kind of points of entry, right? Because now I see it's a data question, it's a framing question. We're talking about similar phenomena, but using different points of entry. So anyway, that was just an insight. I don't know if I have any solutions, but.
I guess, in some senses, though, a 2022 study on, let me just say one data point. A 2022 study about California is about 1 in 3 people serving sentences in California's prisons are there and having their sentences influenced by either the 2-strike provision or the 3 strikes provision. It's just a very significant percent. And it's kind of hard to overlook that. California, we're kind of the leader in this, if you will, and to my eyes, that's kind of unfortunate. So let's take, say, 3 questions. Please, Ms. McDonald.
Thank you. A question for the defunders and the abolitionists. I want to give another example.
That's me.
Comparable to what Rafael mentioned as far as the concentration of crime. In 2021, the U.S. murder rate was 6.8 per 100,000. In Louisville, Kentucky, it was 30 per 100,000. And then there's a neighborhood in Louisville, the Russell neighborhood, that was 194 per 100,000. So if we believe that we are over-policing, would you allocate police resources on the basis of population ratios? So if a city is, say, 20% black and 50% white, should there be 20% of police resources going to that black neighborhood and ignoring the shots fired calls? And to make sure that we're really not over-policing, should there be a quota on arrests. So if police have made a certain number of arrests in the black community that is starting to get over their representation in that city's population, should there be a ceiling on that and we start arresting whites in order to get rid of those racial disparities in over-policing?
Let's take 2 more questions before we move to these. Professor Rahman.
Oh, answering this question?
Oh, no, let's take 2 more questions.
Oh, yeah,
and
we're
then
doing
try
for the
to-
mic. Yeah.
Oh,
Really, is that us?
A couple quick points. You brought up how, in a very heartrending story, how parents who have to send their kids out into crime-prone neighborhoods worry about them going out into those crime-prone neighborhoods. Think about them like they're going off to a combat zone, going into military service. And that's true. You know what's also true? The conversation I had to sit down and have with all my 3 black sons when they turned 7, 8 years old about the dangers they were going to face from police, and how many black parents I talked to, right, who have to have that same painful conversation because they know their kids are going to pay the black tax with respect to their interactions with those cops, right? So that cuts both ways. Chuck, here in California, up until 10 years ago, we in California were paroling nobody, virtually nobody. You were going before a parole board 0 to 4 on average, year in and year out. Really, thousands of people going no parole. Then thanks to the Post-Conviction Justice Project that you know well.
Well, it's your school.
Yeah, you know well though. You were there too, the Post-Conviction Justice Project with Heidi Rummel and those folks, Lawrence, the case in California and others. We went from 0, roughly a year, to, in the last 10 years, 10,000 parolees. Lifers and lifers without parole. You're talking about, well, we can't do anything with people who are older, 65 and older, 25% recidivism rate. Less than, and check this, what we need to do is check some of the math on this, because I hear a lot of math being thrown around here that, like I said this morning, isn't panning out. Check the math on this, less than 1% recidivism rate. 10,000 people we've released in the last 10 years, lifers without parole, less than 1% recidivism rate.
And it was also Governor Schwarzenegger who didn't veto or stop the releases, right? He was sort of the first governor to do that because nobody was going to call the Terminator soft on crime.
Just a very quick point. So, Rafael, I wanted to touch on something you said. So, you had quoted some statistics related to the number of touch points that folks who go on to commit serious crimes have with the criminal legal system. There's some really interesting research that in the public health side, which is kind of what I know, the literature I know better, looking at the number of people who have overdosed and died who've had lots of contact with the criminal legal system. And one conclusion, and you seem to imply that we're not doing enough or keeping people incarcerated enough to prevent that harm, but you could also have come away with the opposite conclusion, which is the intervention of the criminal legal system in the lives of those folks is not preventing future harm. So I just wanted to see what you would respond to that.
So we have great questions.
Yeah.
Can we go quickly down?
Yeah, very, very quickly. At least, from the standpoint of the kind of equitable policing frame hypothetical that I think that's what you wanted us to respond to, Heather. Abolitionists don't want equal policing or equality of suffering. This is not about creating that. It's an entirely new framework, and it's a different way of responding to harm. And so maybe because defund has been co-opted and demonized, maybe if we just call this budget austerity, we'd feel more comfortable about thinking about how to reallocate funding from one public good that's not efficacious in the way that it could be to another. And the other thing is, to ask abolitionists to defend institutions that are the product of the policies and the research of neoliberal policies, conservative, progressive policy. Why do the abolitionists have to defend the existing status quo, right? I think for many abolitionist groups, they are idealistic in their ambitions for this country. Shame on them, I suppose. But also, they're actually doing the work too, right? They're working in many, like the Coalition to Elect a Just DA, Larry Krasner's, there were abolitionists in that group, right? So they're doing the work. So I don't think they should be framed as idealistic, naive, and just doing theory, right? They're just maybe a little too hopeful for what the country's history, I think, maybe illuminates.
I was going to make largely the same point that Professor Morgan just made, which is, and this is kind of an all day. It's been a little, I'm trying to understand, like, we keep pointing to policing's failures. We keep pointing to failures or harms from a system of policing and then telling abolitionists to explain why that happened, you know? That if policing is failing to ensure public safety, that's all day I've been kind of hearing that as the case for policing rather than an example of why it's not working. Like, you know, I don't think they got rid of the police in Louisville. I don't think they defunded the police in Louisville. But I'm being explained, it's always this obligation is being put on the critics to have to explain, to defend the current system, when, like Professor Morgan said, what abolitionists are calling for is, let's think about what is causing these problems and get to their root. Let's think about what it takes to address these. And I don't think that's an easy, I don't want to make it sound like it's an easy thing, it's an overnight thing. It does entail a transformation of society, but that is what is required to actually address these things, rather than let's keep trying the same failed thing that everyone keeps pointing out to us is the problem, and maybe if we just do a little more of it, this time it'll work.
How would you deploy your officers? If you object to them being over-policing in minority neighborhoods, how should we assess a fair, racially equitable deployment of officers?
We're not trying to achieve a racially equitable deployment of officers. I think that was the point. It's not let's figure out the right amount of, let's make sure there's enough black policing and not enough white policing. I think that, you know, that's not what anyone's calling for. Instead, it's calling for, let's figure out what can ensure public safety for everyone, rich, poor, black, white, everyone.
So there were two questions. One, was kind of about this idea of the talk, right? It's a very sort of common idea, and I think, look, to the extent that it's a reality, it's one that I think is a function of an overestimation of the likelihood of being the subject of police violence. It's a very rare phenomenon. In 2018, police officers fired their weapons about 3,000 times that year. Sounds like a lot, right? Only 365 days in a year, but you're talking about, at the time, about 680,000 officers making 10.3 million arrests. If you assume one shooting per arrest, that's about one shooting in every 0.03% of arrests. That's not a very common occurrence. If you look at non-deadly force, it doesn't become more common. But there's another statistic that I think gets at this a little more directly. If you look at, there was a study done in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that put the odds of dying at the hands of police at 1 in 1,000 for black men. Contrast that with the odds for all Americans generally of being killed by gun assault generally, which according to the National Safety Council are dramatically higher at 1 in 298. That's a massive difference, especially when you consider that the odds for black men dying of gun assault not by the police is significantly higher than 1 in 298. And yet, if we're only giving the talk about the potential threat posed by police, then I think it's just reflecting in a gross overestimation of what the actual risk is that's posed by that. And then the second question I got was sort of the idea that, well, could you read the sort of repeat offender problem to suggest that the criminal justice system isn't being effective? I suppose you could read it that way. I wouldn't, particularly because the criminal justice system is only effective if it actually does the thing it's supposed to do, which is, in my opinion, the most important thing that it does is incapacitates, active offenders. And if we continue to release them, then it's not a surprise that they continue to get involved. There's some people who would suggest that involvement in the criminal justice system is criminogenic, that incarceration is criminogenic. I don't think there's a lot of good research behind that. There are some studies showing criminogenic effects of incarceration, but it's really hard from a sort of social science standpoint to get at, what the effect of a given treatment on a given outcome is going to be, particularly in the criminal justice system, because you can't really do randomized control trials in that setting because it's not very ethical. You can't say, like, okay, we know you murdered this guy, but we're going to release you to see what happens. Right? So you try and find little parts of the system that are somewhat random. You try and find these natural experiments. So in the criminogenic impact research, which you find are a lot of random judge assignment studies, because that's one element of the system that's kind of random, right? Your case gets randomly assigned to a judge, and in certain jurisdictions, you can categorize judges along a spectrum of leniency to harshness, and you can break out the judges in the middle of the distribution and look at just the tail ends and whose cases get randomly assigned to the harsh judges and result in incarceration, whose cases get assigned to the lenient judges and result in diversion. But then you have to figure out a way to sort of randomize for the offender pool, but you can't do that, so you use a big data set to identify people who are on the margins of incarceration, so people whose criminal history and criminal conduct is not so serious that, incarceration would be a foregone conclusion on conviction, but it's not so low level that diversion would be a foregone conclusion either. The problem is that literature, which does, although not universally, show that oftentimes the person who's on the margins of incarceration that gets incarcerated by the harsh judge does worse on the recidivism front than the person who gets diverted. That literature has been grafted onto a population, the general prison population, that's a much different risk proposition. Someone who's on the margins of incarceration is not the same risk of the median prisoner. And that's, I think, the sort of analytical error that's made there.
John, last word?
So my last word, I guess, what came across all day is that we all want the same thing, right? We all want safe communities. We come at it from different angles. But I think for purposes of this panel, the police in some form, and we might disagree on how much they need to be involved, but need to be a part of the solution. Now, that we can be as creative as we want, and there are other partners that have to be out there, but they are for sure a part of the equation. And to talking about sort of the violent crime, and that's a young man's game. And I think, everybody in this room would sort of look at the research and see what's happening around the country, and they're getting younger and younger that are committing these violent crimes. So that's something that we have to grapple with. We really haven't talked about the sort of the age of the offenders, but we have to do something about the juvenile crime that is increasing. That's an idea for the Heritage Foundation and Berkeley Law for another one on juvenile crime and what we do in juvenile justice in this country. So that's all I have, but thank you very much.
Great. So please join me in thanking the panel. And is it upstairs? No.
I'm so hungry. Yeah, I'm just haven't eaten in like 4 hours. So.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to everyone in the room for making it to the end of our program. It's been a very long, full day. If you are looking at your program, you'll see that it says John Yoo is giving the closing remarks, and I am not John Yoo. John asked me to stand in for him and encouraged me to make a list of all the things I disagreed with over the course of the day and then rebut each of those points methodically, one by one. But I'm not going to do that. No, I actually think John asked me to do this because he didn't want to be the last thing standing between all of you and your weekend. And I'm happy to do that for just a couple of moments. First of all, to thank John. This was his idea. This conference was his idea. And to thank all of our co-hosts and co-organizers. A tremendous amount of work went into arranging airfare and hotels and travel and food and IT support and all of the day-to-day details. Caroline, Drew, thank you both so much for the long hours to make today possible. I want to make one or two other very brief points before we move on to the reception that is waiting for us. And that is to say that I think we achieved a lot today. And it may not feel that way, and I think we're going to have to reflect on it later. But I mean, Cully and I, for example, agree on lots of things. We agree that he wrote a book and that it's about prosecutors. Yeah. All joking aside, we actually agree on a lot. And I think it's a testament to that. If you look at this last panel, the panel on which perhaps there are the most deep ideological divides, it was the most cordial, the most civil, frankly, the most respectful. I found myself nodding along with lots of things being said by all four panelists and disagreeing with some things said by all four panelists. Events like this one are exceedingly rare. It is so uncommon to put people in the same room on the same panel who have disagreements that are as profound in their fundamental framework for how they view the world. And perhaps that's because it's uncomfortable. But we should all remember, regardless of our political perspectives, and there's a book that if you haven't read it by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind, that talks about how human beings, all of us, tend to seek out information and stories and facts that fit our existing worldview, that are not at odds with the narrative that we like to craft about the world. And that has very serious pitfalls for democracy. We have to engage with views that are at odds with our own. We have to find ways to grapple with facts that don't comfortably or easily support our preferences for policies or for understanding the world. And I, for one, came away today feeling challenged, feeling humbled, feeling grateful to be part of this intellectual community. I know that we did not all change our minds about the work we do, and that's okay. There's good news and there's bad news. Let me start with the bad news. We have a lot of work ahead of us, collectively, individually, as a society, to achieve the goal that, as John said, we all most want, which is safe communities. We have a lot of work to do. That's something I know we can all agree on. That's the bad news, a lot of work. The good news is there's a reception waiting for us, and let's get over there and enjoy. Thank you.